Welcome back to Timeless Thinkers, the channel where history's greatest minds speak again and where we explore the ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, and in our first episode, we saw how Machiavelli shattered political idealism and introduced an unflinching realism about power. Today, we meet a thinker who took that realism and built something entirely new upon it. Thomas Hobbes didn't simply describe a political power as Machiavelli did. He constructed a systematic theory to explain why government must exist at all, what legitimizes its authority, and what price we must pay for civilization itself. This is the Book of Leviathan, published in 1651 amid England's constitutional crisis, and how Thomas Hobbes fundamentally transformed political philosophy by grounding legitimate authority not in divine right, tradition, or natural hierarchy, but in rational human consent born from fear and necessity. Thomas Hobbes was born prematurely on April 5, 1588, in Westport, England. His mother, terrified by news of the approaching Spanish Armada threatening invasion, went into early labor. Hobbes would later write that fear and I were born twins together, a statement that would prove prophetic for a philosopher who made fear the cornerstone of political obligation. Born into modest circumstances, Hobbes received his education through the patronage of a wealthy uncle who recognized his intellectual gifts. At Oxford, he studied the traditional Aristotelian curriculum, logic, rhetoric, and scholastic philosophy, though he found much of it intellectually stagnant. What truly shaped Hobbes's thinking was what came after Oxford. His position as tutor to the Cavendish family, one of England's most prominent aristocratic houses. This wasn't merely employment, it was intellectual liberation. The position provided Hobbes access to extensive libraries, European travel, and England's political elite. During 3 grand tours of the continent between 1610 and 1636, Hobbes encountered the scientific revolution firsthand. He met Galileo Galilei in Florence, discussed philosophy with René Descartes and Pierre Gassendi in Paris, and witnessed the transformation of natural philosophy through mathematics and empirical observation. This exposure to the new science profoundly influenced Hobbes's approach to politics. If Galileo could mathematize motion and reduce physical phenomena to matter in motion, governed by natural laws, why couldn't political philosophy achieve similar rigor? Why couldn't human behavior and social organization be analyzed with geometric precision, starting from first principles rather than inherited authority? It was England's descent into constitutional crisis and civil war that transformed Hobbes from a talented scholar into a revolutionary political theorist. Throughout the 1630s, tensions between King Charles I and Parliament escalated over questions of taxation, religious authority, and sovereign prerogative. In 1642, these tensions exploded into armed conflict. The English Civil War was catastrophic. It wasn't a conflict between nations, but a war within a nation. Indeed, within communities, even families. Royalists fought parliamentarians, Anglicans fought Puritans. Neighbors killed neighbors over competing claims about who possessed legitimate authority and on what grounds. Contemporary estimates suggest approximately 200,000 deaths, nearly 4% of England's population, making it proportionally one of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. Hobbes, who harbored royalist sympathies and feared for his safety, fled to France in 1640. He would remain in exile for 11 years, watching from Paris as his homeland tore itself apart. In 1649, the unthinkable occurred. Parliament tried, convicted, and publicly executed King Charles I.
the traditional foundation of political authority, divine right monarchy sanctioned by God and legitimized by hereditary succession, had been literally decapitated. It was in this context of trauma, exile, and civilizational collapse that Hobbes composed Leviathan. He wasn't engaged in abstract speculation, but attempting to solve the most urgent practical problem imaginable. How do you prevent political society from destroying itself? What is the foundation of legitimate authority when traditional foundations have failed?
Before examining Hobbes' substantive arguments, we must understand his revolutionary methodology, because Hobbes doesn't simply offer different political conclusions, he transforms how political philosophy itself should be conducted. Traditional political philosophy proceeded from established institutions and sought to justify them through appeals to authority. Medieval theorists invoked divine law, natural law implanted by God, and Aristotelian teleology, claiming humans are naturally political animals destined for life in the polis. Political legitimacy flowed downward, from God to king to subject, or rested on ancient customs and inherited rights. Hobbes demolishes this entire approach. He proposes to construct political philosophy as Euclid constructed geometry, or as Galileo was reconstructing physics, beginning with definitions and axioms about human nature, then reasoning forward with logical rigor to necessary conclusions. This is the irresolutive compositive method. Resolve complex phenomena into their simplest elements, then recompose understanding by showing how complex phenomena necessarily arise from those elements. His instrument is the thought experiment we now call the state of nature reasoning. Imagine stripping away all government, all positive law, all social institutions, every artificial construct of human civilization. What remains? Individual humans with certain natural characteristics, capacities, and motivations. Only by understanding this pre-political condition can we understand what political order is for, what makes it necessary, and what form it must take.
This methodological individualism is radical. Hobbes doesn't start with the people as an organic collective, or with natural social bonds, or with divinely ordained hierarchies. He starts with isolated individuals, each pursuing self-preservation according to their own judgment. Political order becomes something that must be constructed through human will, not something given by God or nature. This approach has profound implications. If political authority doesn't flow from God or natural hierarchy, but must be constructed by humans, then its legitimacy depends on whether that construction actually serves the purpose for which it was created. Authority becomes conditional, functional, based on performance rather than birthright or divine sanction. Hobbes is inventing what we now recognize as social contract theory, though his version will prove far more absolutist than later contract theorists like Locke or Rousseau. The innovation lies not in the conclusion, but in the method. Political philosophy as rational reconstruction from first principles about human nature. So what does Hobbes discover when he examines human nature in its natural condition, stripped of all social conditioning and political constraint? The answer is disturbing.
Hobbes's analysis of the state of nature begins with a claim that appears progressive, even democratic. Humans are naturally equal. But this equality, far from being a blessing, becomes the source of perpetual conflict and insecurity. What does Hobbes mean by natural equality? Not that all individuals possess identical capabilities. Obviously, some are stronger, others more intelligent, some possess superior skills. Rather, Hobbes argues that differences in individual capacities are relatively modest and cannot establish secure domination. The strongest person can be killed by the weakest through cunning, coalition, or simply catching them asleep. The most intelligent person is never so superior that they can permanently dominate all others through mental capacity alone. This equality of vulnerability produces what Hobbes called equality of hope. If I want something you possess, I have a reasonable expectation of obtaining it through force, cunning, or alliance, and you have similar expectations regarding my possessions. No natural hierarchy exists sufficient to establish stable superiority and subordination. Now, Hobbes identifies the three principal causes of conflict inherent in human nature and the state of nature's structure. First, competition. Humans desire the same scarce goods: food, shelter, resources, sexual partners. When two people desire the same thing that both cannot have, they become enemies, seeking to destroy or subdue each other. Second, diffidence or mutual distrust. Even if I'm not naturally aggressive and desire only modest possessions necessary for survival, I cannot trust that you share my moderation. You might attack me preventively, fearing that I'll attack you. Knowing this, I'm rationally compelled to strike first as a defensive measure. This creates what is called a security dilemma. Actions taken for defensive purposes are indistinguishable from offensive preparations, triggering preemptive aggression from others.
Third, glory or reputation. Humans seek honor, recognition, and respect. We're sensitive to slights, contempt, and challenges to our standing. In the state of nature, where no authority can adjudicate disputes over honor, even minor disagreements escalate to violence. Moreover, reputation for strength and willingness to fight provides deterrent value, incentivizing violent responses to even small provocations. These three causes, competition, diffidence, and glory, operating among naturally equal individuals with no common power to keep them in awe, produce Hobbes's most famous conclusion. The state of nature is a state of war. Not necessarily continuous combat, Hobbes clarifies, but a condition where no assurance exists against violence. Just as cloudy weather means disposition toward rain without constant rainfall, war means known disposition toward violence without constant fighting. In this condition, Hobbes writes in one of philosophy's most memorable passages, "There is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account to time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." This is crucial. The misery of the state of nature doesn't result from human depravity or moral corruption. It follows logically from natural equality, scarcity, and rational self-interest operating without coordinating authority. Hobbes has identified what modern political science calls a collective action problem, a situation where individually rational behavior produces collectively disastrous outcomes. Having established the state of nature as a condition of war, Hobbes now introduces a concept that initially seems to make everything worse: the right of nature, or jus naturale. In the state of nature, each person possesses unlimited liberty to do whatever they judge necessary for self-preservation. This isn't a right granted by law or convention, it's simply the absence of any obligation to refrain from any action. There are no moral constraints, no laws, no duties owed to others that could limit what one may do. Think carefully about the implications. If you judge that killing someone will improve your security, you have the right to kill them. If you judge that taking their property increases your chances of survival, you have the right to take it. If you judge that breaking an agreement serves your preservation better than keeping it, you have the right to break it. This right of nature extends to all things, even, Hobbes says provocatively, to one another's bodies if necessary for self-preservation. In the state of nature, there is no injustice, because injustice consists in violating law. And law doesn't exist without a sovereign to create and enforce it. The concepts of right and wrong, justice and injustice simply have no application.
This appears to be moral nihilism, and regarding the state of nature, it is. But Hobbes isn't celebrating this condition, he's demonstrating its horror. The unlimited right of nature provides no security whatsoever, because everyone possesses the same unlimited right. Rights without enforcement mechanisms are merely abstract claims providing no actual protection. Moreover, this situation is objectively terrible for everyone involved. Even the strongest, most capable individual in the state of nature lives in constant insecurity. You might be powerful today, but you must sleep tonight. You can't be perpetually vigilant. Coalitions can form against you. Disease or injury can weaken you. In a condition where everyone has right to everything, no one has secure possession of anything. But here, Hobbes makes a crucial turn. Humans aren't merely passionate creatures driven by appetite and fear. They also possess reason, the capacity to calculate means towards ends. And reason, examining the misery of the state of nature, suggests a way out. This brings us to the laws of nature.
The laws of nature in Hobbes' system are not divine commands, nor are they moral absolutes discoverable through intuition or conscience. They are theorems, rational conclusions about how to preserve one's life, discovered through reasoning about effective means to the end of self-preservation. The first and fundamental law of nature states, seek peace where it can be obtained. Where it cannot, use all advantages of war. This might seem obvious, but it's revolutionary. Hobbes is arguing that reason itself, examining the state of nature, concludes that peace is preferable to war, if achievable on acceptable terms. War isn't good for anyone. It's simply unavoidable without mechanisms to make peace reliable. The second law follows logically from the first. One should be willing to lay down one's right to all things when others are equally willing, transferring that right to a common authority. This is the theoretical foundation of the social contract. If everyone simultaneously agrees to limit their natural liberty, replacing unlimited rights with legally defined rights enforceable by authority, everyone becomes more secure. But immediately a problem emerges, and Hobbes addresses it with characteristic rigor. How can we trust each other to keep this agreement? In the state of nature, nothing enforces covenants. If I surrender my rights, trusting you to surrender yours, but you defect, I've made myself vulnerable. If we both surrender rights, but no enforcement exists, either party might violate the agreement when convenient.
This leads to Hobbes' third law, that men perform their covenants made. Agreements must be kept. But here's the critical point. These laws have no force in the state of nature. Hobbes writes memorably that covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. Moral obligation to keep promises doesn't exist in the state of nature because it would be irrational to keep promises when doing so makes you vulnerable to those who break them. Hobbes lists additional laws of nature. Be grateful for benefits received. Accommodate yourself to others. Pardon offenses when security permits. Avoid cruelty and insult. Treat others as equals.
Judge disputants impartially. Share common resources equitably. These resemble conventional moral rules, and Hobbes summarizes them as equivalent to the Golden Rule. Do not do to others what you did not want done to yourself. But here's what's revolutionary about Hobbes' treatment. These laws of nature aren't derived from divine command, natural law implanted by God, or moral intuition. They're rational principles for self-preservation. A prudent calculator examining the state of nature would recognize that if everyone followed these rules, everyone would be better off. They're what game theory now calls principles of rational cooperation. However, and this is crucial, they cannot be reliably followed in the state of nature. Anyone who acts justly, keeps promises, and refrains from violence when others don't makes themselves prey. The laws of nature point toward peace and cooperation, but they cannot create these conditions themselves. They're obligations binding in conscience, meaning one should wish for a world where they could be followed, but not in action unless conditions make following them safe. For that transformation, for making the laws of nature operational, something more is needed. A power capable of enforcing these rational principles of cooperation, making it irrational to violate them. This brings us to Hobbes' radical solution.
Here is the pivotal moment in Hobbes' argument, the transformation from natural war to civil peace through the social contract. But Hobbes' contract differs fundamentally from ordinary agreements and from later social contract theories. This isn't a contract between rulers and ruled, which was the dominant model in medieval political thought. It's not a mutual agreement between king and subjects specifying reciprocal obligations. Rather, it's an agreement among the ruled themselves to create a ruler and vest that ruler with absolute authority. Hobbes envisions each person entering into a covenant with every other person. The content of this covenant is something like, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or this assembly of men on condition that you give up your right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. Everyone simultaneously transfers their natural rights to a single sovereign authority, whether one person, monarchy, a select group, aristocracy, or an assembly, democracy. This creates what Hobbes calls the Leviathan, or mortal god, an artificial person created by covenant representing the united will and power of all. The sovereign isn't a natural individual with natural authority, but an artificial construct, a legal person whose identity and power derive entirely from authorization by subjects. The structure is crucial. The sovereign is not a party to the social contract. The people contract with each other to create and obey the sovereign. This has several vital implications. First, the sovereign cannot breach the contract because they're not bound by it. Subjects authorize the sovereign's power, so they cannot legitimately complain about how it's exercised. Second, disputes about whether the sovereign has exceeded authority cannot be adjudicated because the sovereign is the final judge of all disputes. Third, subjects cannot release themselves from obligation by claiming the sovereign violated the contract, because no such contract exists between them and the sovereign.
Why this structure? Hobbes learned from England's Civil War. If the sovereign is party to a contract with subjects, who judges whether the sovereign has violated it? The king says Parliament violated the ancient constitution. Parliament says the king violated fundamental law. Each claims authority to judge. Neither can definitively settle the dispute. The result is civil war, exactly what the social contract was meant to prevent. Hobbes eliminates this problem by making the sovereign the ultimate judge, accountable to no earthly authority. This seems tyrannical, and in a sense it is, but Hobbes would argue it's the only way to solve the fundamental problem of political order, establishing determinate authority that can actually prevent return to the state of nature. Once the sovereign is created through this multilateral covenant, the state of nature ends. Now, a common power exists capable of enforcing agreements, punishing violations, and providing security.
Now covenants have force, because breaking them brings punishment. Now the laws of nature can actually be followed, because everyone knows everyone else faces the same constraints. The transformation is complete, from natural individuals with unlimited rights and no security to subjects with limited legal rights but real protection. From a condition where everyone has right to everything but secure possession of nothing to a condition where legally defined property provides genuine security. From perpetual fear of violent death to reasonable expectation of peaceful life. This is Hobbes' theoretical solution, but the solution comes with a price that many readers find intolerable: absolute sovereignty.
Having established that sovereign authority must be created through covenant to escape the state of nature, Hobbes now demonstrates that this authority must be absolute, unlimited, and indivisible. This is where his argument becomes most controversial, and where many readers, both contemporary and modern, recoil. Why must sovereignty be absolute? Hobbes' reasoning is systematic. Any limitation on sovereign power creates ambiguity about final authority. If the sovereign can be judged or constrained by another power, then that other power is truly sovereign. You haven't escaped the state of nature, you've merely relocated it to a potential conflict between supposed authorities. Consider what would constitute limits on sovereignty. Perhaps subjects retain certain inalienable rights the sovereign cannot violate. But who judges whether the sovereign has violated them? If subjects judge individually, you have as many judges as subjects, a situation indistinguishable from the state of nature. If some other institution judges, a Supreme Court, a parliament separate from the executive, then that institution possesses ultimate authority and is the real sovereign. Or perhaps sovereignty should be divided among multiple institutions: executive, legislative, judicial, with each checking the others. Hobbes would respond, when these institutions conflict, who decides? If no institution has final say, you have recreated the state of nature at the governmental level. If one institution does have final say, then it alone is truly sovereign and the division is illusory. The sovereign must therefore possess comprehensive powers. Legislative power, the authority to make law, which means to declare what is just and unjust, lawful and unlawful. Executive power, the authority to enforce law, punish violations, and defend the commonwealth against external and internal threats. Judicial power, the authority to adjudicate disputes and determine what the law requires in particular cases. Moreover, the sovereign must control what doctrines are taught and what speech is permitted, because disagreement over fundamentals leads to faction, faction to conflict, and conflict to civil war. England's Civil War had been intensely ideological, driven by disputes over religious doctrine, constitutional principles, and the proper relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Hobbes concludes that the sovereign must determine orthodox belief and prohibit dangerous doctrines.
The sovereign must also have exclusive authority to make war and peace, because divided war-making power creates the possibility of civil conflict. The sovereign must control property rights, because property is conventional. What counts as mine and thine exists only through law, and law exists only through the sovereign. Perhaps most provocatively, Hobbes argues that the sovereign cannot commit injustice against subjects. His reasoning, justice exists only where there is law, and law exists only where there's a sovereign to create it. The sovereign isn't bound by the laws they create, because being bound would require a superior authority to enforce that binding. The sovereign defines what justice means within the commonwealth, so by definition cannot violate it. But, and Hobbes is careful about this doesn't mean the sovereign can do no wrong. The sovereign can sin against God. The sovereign can make foolish decisions harmful to the commonwealth. The sovereign can act cruelly or irrationally. But these aren't injustices against subjects because the subjects authorized all the sovereign's actions when they created the sovereign through covenant. Can subjects ever legitimately resist? Hobbes' answer is stark. No. Even if the sovereign is incompetent, cruel, or tyrannical, resistance leads back toward the state of nature, which is worse than even bad government. The only exception Hobbes allows is immediate self-defense when the sovereign directly threatens your life, because the right of self-preservation is inalienable. You cannot authorize your own death. This is the iron logic of Hobbesian severity. The price of escaping the state of nature is submission to absolute, unlimited authority. Many readers find this price unconscionable. But Hobbes would ask, compared to what alternative? Compared to the state of nature, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Compared to civil war, where neighbors slaughter each other over disputes about authority. The question isn't whether absolute sovereignty is ideal, but whether any alternative can reliably prevent collapse into chaos.
What makes the Hobbesian commonwealth function? What transforms the theoretical social contract into actual political obedience? For Hobbes, the answer is unflinchingly realistic: fear. Subjects don't obey the sovereign out of natural sociability, moral duty, love, or patriotic sentiment. They obey because they fear punishment for disobedience more than they desire the benefits of disobedience. This isn't a cynical add-on to Hobbes' theory, it's fundamental to how the social contract works. Remember why subjects enter the social contract: to escape the fear of violent death in the state of nature. They calculate that submission to authority, while constraining their liberty, provides better security than unlimited liberty with unlimited insecurity. The covenant is instrumentally rational, motivated by fear and sustained by fear. But the fear changes character. In a state of nature, you fear every person you encounter because anyone might kill you and no authority prevents it. Under sovereign authority, you fear primarily the law and its enforcement. This represents a massive reduction in fear and increase in security. You still fear, but you fear a single, predictable source of punishment rather than universal random violence. Moreover, Hobbes argues that the obligation to obey the sovereign lasts exactly as long as the sovereign can protect you. Political obligation is conditional on the sovereign's effectiveness. If the sovereign is conquered by a foreign invasion, your obligation transfers to the conqueror. If the sovereign becomes too weak to maintain order and you're forced to protect yourself, your obligation ends. If the sovereign explicitly abandons you, your obligation ceases.
This is profoundly unsentimental. There's no sacred bond between ruler and ruled, no loyalty for loyalty's sake, no patriotic duty independent of the sovereign's capacity to provide security. The Commonwealth is held together by calculated self-interest backed by credible threat of punishment. Hobbes would say this isn't cynicism, but realism. England had just witnessed how quickly sacred oaths, traditional loyalties, and religious duties dissolved when civil war erupted. Appeals to ancient rights, divine sanction, and moral obligation hadn't prevented catastrophe. Only clear-eyed recognition of what actually motivates human behavior can provide stable foundations for order. The sovereign maintains order through punishment severe enough to make law-breaking irrational. Crime occurs not because people are evil, but because they calculate that benefits exceed likely costs. Make punishment certain and severe enough, and most people will obey most of the time. This requires the sovereign's power to be visible, awesome, and effectively deployed. Hence the image on Leviathan's frontispiece showing a giant figure made of human bodies, wielding sword and staff, towering over the landscape. But there's a deeper point.
Fear of the sovereign is preferable to fear of everyone. Subjection to law is preferable to subjection to arbitrary violence. Limited legal liberty is preferable to unlimited natural liberty, accompanied by unlimited insecurity. The Hobbesian bargain isn't freedom for security. It's one kind of fear and constraint for another, better kind.
One of Leviathan's most controversial and elaborate arguments concerns religion. Nearly half the text addresses theological questions. Hobbes' position is uncompromising and was seen as dangerously heretical by many contemporaries. The sovereign must possess ultimate authority over religious doctrine and ecclesiastical organization within the Commonwealth. Why does Hobbes devote such attention to religion? Because England's civil war was inseparable from religious conflict. The dispute between king and parliament wasn't merely about taxation and constitutional prerogatives, it was deeply entangled with questions about church governance, worship practices, and the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Should the church be governed by bishops appointed by the king, following the Anglican model, or by presbyters elected by congregations following the Presbyterian model? Or should each congregation be independent, following the independent or congregationalist model? Should worship follow prescribed liturgy or allow spontaneous prayer? Could subjects resist a king whose religious policies violated conscience? These weren't abstract theological questions, they were matters over which men killed each other. Hobbes' solution is characteristically radical. The sovereign possesses final authority over all religious matters within the Commonwealth. The sovereign determines orthodox doctrine, controls ecclesiastical appointments, interprets Scripture authoritatively, and regulates public worship. There cannot be two ultimate authorities, one temporal, one spiritual, because competing ultimate authorities create the possibility of conflicting obligations and therefore civil war.
Hobbes distinguishes between internal belief and external practice. True religious belief is internal and cannot be commanded. You cannot force someone to genuinely believe. But religious practice, what you say publicly, what rituals you perform, what doctrines you profess, can and must be regulated by the sovereign. If the sovereign commands you to profess a doctrine or perform a ritual, you must obey, externally, whatever your private beliefs. This scandalized both Catholics and Protestants. Catholics believed the Pope possessed universal spiritual authority independent of temporal rulers. Many Protestants believed individual conscience should be free from state control in religious matters. Hobbes rejected both positions, subordinating all ecclesiastical authority to civil sovereignty. His contemporaries accused him of atheism, which was extremely dangerous in 17th century England. He denied it, but his arguments were suspicious. He explained miracles naturalistically, suggested prophecy had ended with the apostles, treated Scripture as requiring naturalistic interpretation, and seemed to reduce religion to a tool of political control. Whether Hobbes was a secret atheist remains debated. But clearly his primary commitment was to political order, and he was willing to subordinate religious authority completely to achieve it. God's kingdom, he argued, was not yet of this world. In the meantime, the Leviathan rules absolutely over all matters, spiritual and temporal alike. This position on religion reveals the comprehensiveness of Hobbesian sovereignty. Nothing, not conscience, not Scripture, not ecclesiastical tradition, can limit sovereign authority, because any such limit creates the possibility of conflict between authorities, and such conflict risks civil war.
Having constructed his theory of absolute sovereignty, Hobbes faces an obvious objection. Doesn't absolute power inevitably produce tyranny? Doesn't a limited authority tempt rulers toward cruelty, oppression, and self-aggrandizement? Haven't we simply replaced the violence of the state of nature with the violence of despotism? Hobbes doesn't deny these dangers. He acknowledges that sovereigns can be foolish, cruel, or self-interested. But he argues that even bad government is preferable to the state of nature, and that any attempt to limit sovereignty recreates the conditions for civil war.
Consider the alternatives to absolute sovereignty. Perhaps we could divide power among multiple institutions, each checking the others. But Hobbes would respond, when these institutions conflict, and they inevitably will, who decides? If no institution has final authority, you've recreated the state of nature at the governmental level. If one does have final say, then it alone is truly sovereign, and the division is illusory. Perhaps we could enumerate rights that the sovereign cannot violate, but who judges whether the sovereign has violated them? If subjects judge individually, you have as many final judges as subjects, the definition of the state of nature. If some institution judges, that institution is the real sovereign. Perhaps we could allow resistance when the sovereign becomes tyrannical, but who determines when that threshold is crossed? If subjects decide individually, any subject can declare the sovereign tyrannical whenever they dislike a policy. You've effectively abolished sovereignty and returned to the state of nature. Hobbes's logic seems airtight. Any effective limit on sovereignty requires a higher authority to enforce that limit. But if a higher authority exists, the supposed sovereign isn't actually sovereign. Real sovereignty must be absolute, or it isn't sovereignty at all. Yet Hobbes does recognize some constraints, though they're prudential rather than legal. First, the sovereigns should recognize that their own interest aligns with subjects' welfare. A sovereign who impoverishes or terrorizes subjects weakens the commonwealth and thereby weakens their own position. Enlightened self-interest should moderate tyrannical impulses. Second, the sovereign can't sin against God even while committed no injustice against subjects. Religious sovereigns might be constrained by fear of divine judgment, though this operates through conscience rather than legal obligation.
Third, subjects retain the inalienable right to resist when the sovereign directly threatens their lives, because self-preservation is the foundation of the entire system. You cannot authorize your own death, so a sovereign command to kill yourself generates no obligation. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the sovereign's authority lasts only as long as they can effectively provide protection. A sovereign who cannot maintain order, who is conquered, or who flees loses authority automatically. Obligation is conditional on effectiveness. These constraints are real but limited. They don't create legally enforceable limits on sovereignty. They operate through prudence, conscience, or circumstances rather than institutional checks. Hobbes has solved the problem of order by creating absolute sovereignty, but he hasn't solved the problem of tyranny except by arguing it's preferable to anarchy. This is where critics throughout history have attacked Hobbes most vigorously. John Locke would argue that limited government with rights protections is both possible and necessary. Montesquieu would advocate separation of powers. American founders would design constitutional systems with checks and balances. All are responding to Hobbes by attempting to create effective government without absolute power. Whether these attempts succeed remains contested. Hobbes might respond that in genuine emergencies, war, rebellion, pandemic, economic collapse, governments consistently claim extraordinary powers approaching absolutism. Perhaps his theory describes what effective sovereignty actually requires, even if liberal constitutionalism obscures this reality during normal times.
3.5 centuries after Leviathan's publication, Hobbes remains unavoidable in political philosophy and political science. Not because we accept his conclusions, most don't, but because he established problems and frameworks that subsequent thought must engage. First, Hobbes fundamentally transformed the question of political legitimacy. Pre-Hobbesian political philosophy asked, what makes a ruler rightful? Answers invoked divine right, hereditary succession, natural hierarchy, or virtue. Hobbes asked instead, why should anyone obey government at all? His answer,
The social contract created by rational self-interest became the dominant framework for liberal political thought, even for those who reject his specific conclusions. Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and Rawls all employ social contract reasoning, though modified to yield limited government, natural rights, or democratic equality. They're responding to Hobbes by attempting to show that rational contractors would choose something other than absolute sovereignty. But they accept his basic framework. Legitimate authority must be justified by showing why rational individuals would consent to it. Second, Hobbes made security the primary purpose of government. Not salvation, not virtue, not glory, not the good life, just preventing violent death and maintaining order. This seems minimal, but it's revolutionary. It shifts political philosophy from asking what is the good life and how do politics enable it, to asking how do we maintain stable order, allowing people to pursue their own conceptions of the good life. This separation of political order from comprehensive moral or religious doctrines becomes foundational for liberal political thought. The state doesn't tell you how to live well, it provides security within which you can pursue your own vision of the good life. This is the philosophical foundation for religious toleration, moral pluralism, and limited government. Third, Hobbes revealed what we now call the problem of sovereignty. Who has final authority when authorities conflict? This problem haunted England's Civil War and haunts political systems still. When the Supreme Court conflicts with the executive, who decides? When international law conflicts with national sovereignty, which prevails? When state governments conflict with federal authority, who has final say? When individual conscience conflicts with democratic majorities, what takes precedence? These are fundamentally Hobbesian questions about ultimate authority. Modern constitutional systems attempt to answer them through procedural rules, judicial review, and federalist structures. But Hobbes would likely argue that these solutions work only because some authority, whether the Supreme Court, the Constitution itself, or popular sovereignty, functions as the practical sovereign, even if we don't acknowledge it explicitly. Fourth, Hobbes forced political thought to confront the tension between liberty and security. Every debate about surveillance, emergency powers, detention without trial, or restricting civil liberties in response to terrorism is essentially a debate about the Hobbesian trade-off. How much liberty should we sacrifice for security? Can we have both effective protection and robust freedom?
Post-September 11th debates about the Patriot Act, extraordinary rendition, enhanced interrogation, and NSA surveillance programs are Hobbesian arguments transported to the 21st century. Those emphasizing security often sound Hobbesian. Extraordinary threats require extraordinary powers, and protecting citizens justifies limiting liberties. Those emphasizing liberty respond that Hobbes was wrong. We can have security without absolute power, and absolutism itself becomes a threat. Fifth, Hobbes pioneered the scientific study of politics. By attempting to ground political philosophy in human nature studied empirically rather than in moral ideals or divine commands, he helped create political science as a distinct discipline. His mechanistic view of human beings as matter in motion, driven by appetite and aversion, prefigures modern behavioral and evolutionary approaches to politics. Contemporary political scientists studying rational choice, game theory, public choice economics, or evolutionary psychology are Hobbes's intellectual descendants, even when they don't realize it. The idea that political outcomes can be explained and predicted by analyzing individual incentives and strategic interactions originates substantially with Hobbes. Sixth, Hobbes identified what we now call collective action problems and the difficulty of cooperation under anarchy. His state of nature is essentially an n-person prisoner's dilemma. Everyone would be better off cooperating, but individual rationality leads to defection. This insight is fundamental to modern economics, international relations theory, and social science generally. The realist school of international relations, which views states as power-seeking entities operating in an anarchical international system resembling Hobbes's state of nature, draws directly on Hobbesian logic. In the realist view, the international arena is characterized by a conflict of powers without a sovereign authority to enforce agreements. When realists make this argument, they are making a Hobbesian point about the necessity of sovereign authority for reliable cooperation. Seventh, Hobbes raised questions about constitutionalism that remain unresolved. Can you have effective government with limited powers? Can constitutional constraints be self-enforcing, or do they ultimately depend on some authority willing to enforce them, making that authority the real sovereign? Do constitutions work because they genuinely constrain power, or because they coordinate expectations and create legitimacy for the sovereign? Contemporary constitutional theory grapples with these questions. Legal theorists debate whether constitutions are self-enforcing through judicial review and popular commitment, or whether they ultimately depend on political will and power. Hobbes suggests the latter, that constitutional limits work only when a sovereign authority, courts, political culture, or the people themselves, enforce them, and that authority is functionally absolute even if constitutionally limited. Finally, Hobbes demonstrated both the power and the danger of systematic political theory. His geometric approach, reasoning relentlessly from first principles to necessary conclusions, produces logical elegance, but risks missing complexities that don't fit the system. His theory is internally consistent, but may not capture the full reality of political life. This raises a perennial question. Should political philosophy aim for systematic theory with magical rigor, or for practical wisdom that embraces complexity and ambiguity? Hobbes represents the first approach. Aristotle and Burke represent the second. Modern political thought remains divided between those seeking scientific theories of politics and those emphasizing the limits of theory and the importance of prudence.
Leviathan is not a comfortable book to read or an easy theory to accept. It presents a dark, mechanical view of human nature, an unsparing analysis of political life stripped of romantic illusions, and a solution that seems nearly as oppressive as the problem it addresses. Yet, Hobbes compels our attention because he confronts realities that more optimistic theorists often avoid. The problem of order, how to prevent society from collapsing into violence, isn't hypothetical. We see it whenever states fail, whenever civil wars erupt, whenever social order breaks down. Somalia in the 1990s, Syria in the 2010s, any society experiencing state collapse. These approximate Hobbes' state of nature, and they vindicate his claim that even bad government is preferable to anarchy. Hobbes also forces us to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about political authority. All governments, even democracies, ultimately rest on a monopoly of legitimate force. Law is backed by coercion. Order requires enforcement. We can debate how power should be limited, divided, or made accountable, but we cannot eliminate the necessity of power itself. Liberal constitutionalism tries to square this circle, effective government with limited authority, but Hobbes makes his question whether this is genuinely achievable or merely a comforting fiction. Moreover, Hobbes reveals the fragility of political order. Stable government isn't natural, automatic, or self-sustaining. It's an artificial achievement, constructed through human will and maintained through constant effort. The institutions that protect us from violence, courts, police, legal systems, governments, are human creations that could fail if not properly supported and defended. Taking them for granted is precisely the mistake Hobbes warns against. Yet Hobbes also exemplifies the danger of prioritizing order above all other values.
The 20th century demonstrated that terrible crimes could be committed in the name of security and stability. Totalitarian regimes have used Hobbesian logic to justify unlimited power, crushing individual liberty and dignity in the name of order. We need security, but we also need freedom, justice, and human rights. The question Hobbes leaves us with is whether we can have both, whether political systems can provide effective order while respecting liberty, maintaining security while protecting rights, exercising power while remaining accountable. Hobbes was skeptical. His logic suggests that attempts to limit sovereignty simply relocate it or create ambiguity leading to conflict. Liberal constitutionalism, as it developed after Hobbes, is essentially an extended argument that he was wrong, that we can construct political systems with divided powers, protected rights, and limited government, that nonetheless maintain order effectively. Whether this argument succeeds is something each generation must prove through practice. In our contemporary world, Hobbes' questions remain urgent. How do we respond to terrorism without becoming tyrannical? How do we maintain security while respecting privacy? How do we enforce international law without world government? How do we prevent social media from creating digital states of nature where misinformation and conflict flourish? These questions don't have easy answers, but they demonstrate why Hobbes remains essential reading. He identified fundamental problems of political life that don't disappear just because we find his solutions unpalatable. Understanding Hobbes doesn't require agreeing with him, but it does require taking seriously the problems he identified in the logic with which he addressed them.
Perhaps the deepest lesson of Leviathan is this: political order is a precious and precarious achievement. It requires power, but power must be justified and constrained. It requires authority, but authority must be legitimate and accountable. It requires security, but security must not extinguish liberty. How we balance these competing necessities, how we construct order without tyranny, security without oppression, authority without absolutism, remains the central challenge of political life. Hobbes showed us both the necessity and the danger of sovereign power. Our task is to find ways to harness that necessity while avoiding that danger. Whether we've succeeded or can succeed remains an open question.
This has been Timeless Thinkers, Episode 2, Thomas Hobbes the Leviathan, From State of Nature to Social Contract. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of political philosophy's most powerful and challenging works. If you found this exploration valuable, please subscribe to our channel and like and share this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Hobbes was right that absolute sovereignty is necessary for order? Can we have effective government without unlimited power? Or have liberal democracies proven that Hobbes was too pessimistic about human capacity for self-governments? In our next episode, we'll meet a philosopher who directly challenged Hobbes' dark vision and offered a very different theory of natural rights, limited government, and political legitimacy. A theory that would inspire revolutions and shape modern democracy. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember, understanding the foundations of political order and the price we pay for it helps us recognize when those foundations are threatened and what we must do to preserve both security and freedom.